Afternoon. I'm Patrick Cronin. I'm the Senior Director of the Asia-Pacific Security Program. We're along with Eli Ratner and our Asia team. We are focused every day on thinking about both short-term challenges and opportunities and long-term challenges and opportunities. But today's panel, we decided to bring together people with a lot of experience to talk about their views about the risks and opportunities across the Indo-Pacific. And what's on my mind with this question is that for decades, I've assumed that the Indo-Pacific region is the locus of opportunity in the 21st century. And indeed, economic integration is providing that great engine of hope. Energy is a big factor in the future. But increasingly, it looks like the United States is the only risk-averse country in the region. China's tailored coercion in the East and South China Seas and along the periphery, Russia's annexation of the Crimea and alignment with China in blocking U.S. and other initiatives, Japan's desire to establish a new post-war identity that holds the line on its interests, Vietnam, the Philippines. Of course, North Korea was always risk acceptant, General Thurman, but that was the outlier. Now it's become the norm. And so there's a huge question here about how we're going to manage these risks in the short term and how we're going to manage them in the long term, if they're manageable. And then what finally is the big opportunity for policy, especially for U.S. policy as we think about the future. We've got a tremendous panel here to help us think this through. Ambassador Nicholas Burns, career diplomat, former Undersecretary of Policy at the State Department, is now a professor of practice at the Kennedy School at Harvard University. Stephanie Kleine-Ahlbrandt is the director of the Asia-Pacific Program at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and after having been on the ground in China doing a lot of work with the International Crisis Group. Vikram Singh has left the Pentagon and State Department and the administration to now become Vice President of National Security and International Policy at the Center for American Progress. Most recently was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia. Dr. David Gordon, Chairman and Head of Research at the Eurasia Group, which does tremendous risk analysis, was the former Director of Policy Planning at the State Department and many years in the government and intelligence. And General James D. Thurman, a career and consummate military officer, was the commander of the U.S. Forces Korea, Combined Forces Command, UN Command in Korea most recently. So thank you, all of you, for joining us. I wonder, Nick, if we can start with you in terms of thinking about how do you think about the big risk for the U.S. and for the region right now across this region?
Patrick, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Good. First of all, I want to say, Patrick, I think you've chosen the right terminology in the Indo-Pacific. Robert Kaplan wrote there you go. Let me start again. Thank you, Patrick. It's a pleasure to be here with this very distinguished panel, friends and colleagues from the U.S. government. David and I work together. I think you've chosen the right terminology to refer to Indo-Pacific. A lot of you will have read Robert Kaplan's 2010 book, Monsoon, but one of the central themes of that book is that we ought to think about the Indian Ocean region in its broadest expanse, from the east coast of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, across the Arabian Sea, the Indian subcontinent, the Bay of Bengal, onto the Strait of Malacca. He says it's the central locus of power in the 21st century. It's akin to what the Mediterranean has been for the past 4 centuries. It's where the majority of the container traffic and oil and gas transit from west to east. It's where the majority of the rising powers are and the strongest militaries are. So I think you framed it correctly. I would say there's 2 big threats that we've got to worry about in that region and one big opportunity. Short-term threat that the general will know a lot about, more than I will, is the unpredictability of the North Korean regime. I think people underplay this in the United States. I've been persuaded by Patrick. We were together in Hong Kong a couple of months ago, and he convinced me, and you should say more about this, that that regime and the consequences of a North Korean action against our ally, South Korea, both unpredictable, very dangerous, and the current South Korean president is going to have to respond in some way, perhaps in a way that the prior governments did not. So I watch North Korea. I think the largest threat for us and the big issue for the next half century obviously is going to be our relationship with China. And here I'd say it's going to be very difficult for American presidents and secretaries of state in the future to balance 2 competing priorities. On the one hand, we're going to be China's most important partner in the world, and China will be ours. on global trade and investment, on climate change, on terrorism, on proliferation. We're not going to be able to accomplish a lot globally unless we have an effective working relationship with the Chinese leadership. But if you look at the other half of the equation, while we'll be each other's most important partner, we are going to be competitors for power in Asia. It's already starting. You see it in the way that the Chinese are flexing their muscles with their difficult, obstreperous behavior in the South China Sea, vis-a-vis the Philippines and Vietnam, certainly in what I think are the irresponsible actions of the PLA in the East China Sea crisis. You see it in the way they've reacted to the rebalancing or pivot of the Obama administration since 2011, essentially saying the United States is not an Asia-Pacific power, when of course we are and have been historically. So managing that is going to be terribly difficult. Because we've never had a relationship in the history of the United States where our closest partner on economic and transnational issues is going to be our most important competitor for power. I'll just close, Patrick, because I know you want to run through these issues rapidly, by saying a lot of us know Ambassador Steve Bosworth. He's now a colleague of mine at the Harvard Kennedy School. Steve spoke to my class, my Great Powers class, about a month ago, and he told them, he said, not only will the US-China relationship be the most important relationship we have, but the most difficult foreign policy challenge, he said, the United States will ever have faced is this challenge we have of keeping the peace with China so that we never fight, but not being dominated by China, and retaining the predominant role of the United States military in the Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific region. Whether you agree with that statement or not, it was made by a very serious person, and that presents a real challenge. As we get to the end of this, and I know Vikram and I can talk about this for a long time, our greatest opportunity, and we must do it in the next few months, is to revive our strategic partnership with India, because that informs the ability to retain US predominance and to make sure that China, as it rises in a sea, an Indo-Pacific, of a strong India, strong Japan, strong United States.
Nick, thank you very much. And Stephanie, as a China specialist in particular, trying to help us think through China. I was just looking at the headlines this morning alone, and it's just remarkable about the common messaging that's coming out. I mean, forgive me, a new Cold War, question mark, writes Barry Desker in Singapore Straits Times. Conflict looms in Asia's cauldron, quoting Bob Kaplan's latest book. Is China's dream Asia's nightmare? I mean, those are just 3 of about 10, just in today's papers around the world. So what is going on with China?
Well, I was actually going to go a bit counterintuitive, especially since
exactly. Please.
So we've spoken a lot about China, but I firmly believe that getting China right requires an effective regional policy. And particularly now when we're looking at the types of whatever you call it, salami tactics or the cabbage leaf, China's employing non-militarized coercion through a series of administrative, legal, diplomatic, law enforcement measures, always with the military utilizes sort of intimidation behind as a way of making progress on getting control over its long-claimed territories. And this is presenting huge challenges both to us and to our allies and friends in the region who are at a loss really as to how do you respond to this. So I think if we're looking at ways forward, we have to address some of the perception issues. I think that we've been doing more and more. I was just at Shangri-La. Secretary Hagel had a lot to say about the different measures that we're taking, but I'd say the anxiety level in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia amongst our partners and friends is at the highest level I've seen in a long time. Either they are not seeing our actions on the ground, or they're not the types of actions they would like to see on the ground. Maybe a ship visit a year is important to them as a trade agreement, or looking at how they can perhaps lessen their economic dependence in certain sectors on China. I think that there's a lot to be done with maritime domain awareness, whereby certainly through deterrence, we give these countries more room to pursue and strengthen their law enforcement capacity. But there also needs to be a strengthening of intelligence sharing so that when Chinese ships are on the way to Scarborough Shoal, there's announcement and warning, and then, for example, the Philippines can come up with a more appropriate solution. So I'm looking more a bit at some of the issues we have in helping countries in the region effectively deal with increasing Chinese pressure, because since AIDAS, it's been simply a list. You know, the tensions keep rising. We've got everything from Second Thomas Shoal, we've got the oil rig in the Vietnam's EZ. These countries are saying we really appreciate how vocal the United States is across the board. The Vietnamese ambassador has said recently that he's very appreciative of all the different, but what can you actually do to help us on the ground? Port visits are fine, but we're really being inundated with Chinese law enforcement vessels and different types of coercion that are intelligently done precisely to remain under the threshold of military intervention.
Stephanie, just a quick follow-up on China on this. Evan Medeiros, their top official at the White House looking at Asia, and a China specialist as well, likes to talk about the three-pillared approach of engaging China, we're certainly doing that, binding China, of which we're having some difficulty,
That's right.
and balancing China, where there's a lot going on now in balancing.
That's right.
Is the binding question particularly difficult?
Well, the binding question here, we get into some of the legal issues. So we have this case of arbitration of the Philippines. And, the Philippines is essentially putting into question some of China's claims under the 9-dash line. What we need to be doing in this context is going around to our friends and partners around the world, all of whom have an interest, obviously, in freedom of navigation and the existence of a rules-based order in that part of the world, which includes all of our friends in NATO, et cetera, to be getting them on board behind this type of a dispute, to putting pressure on China to actually respond to the invitation by the court for them to submit something by December 12. I think that the problem right now is that it's seen as a U.S.-China issue because we're the ones coming in saying international law and institutions and norms need to be respected, and yet it should be much more widespread than that. The Europeans have traditionally been the ones who have been, the guardians of international order and norms-based system. I think if we're looking at binding China, the way to do it is that they aren't able to pick off countries one by one, which they've done very well. And the U.S. going out there and trying to get more support for this decision means that when it comes down, it will be much more difficult for China to try to delegitimize the entire court and the United Nations along with it, because there'll be much more support behind it.
And Vikram, Stephanie's brought in a good question about the regional policy. Of course, it's not just the claimant states like the Philippines and Vietnam, but it's also big states like Indonesia with a big election next month, Malaysia, where the president just had a very successful visit, Singapore, which has been a stalwart kind of strategic partner for the United States. How do we work in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, which is a fairly weak institution, but one that's still developing, as well as the earlier questions about risk for you?
So I think that's a great question, Patrick, and thank you. And I think I agree with everything that I've just heard from my fellow panelists. So I'll try to move to two things and do it very quickly. And the last thing I say will get to this issue of cooperating with ASEAN. I think there's sort of a few buckets of risk that we're facing. So the risk question, the one that's most present in everyone's mind, is what you might call sort of the flashpoint risk, and that is something that exists from the India-Pakistan disputes to the East China Sea, right? So, and certainly the Korean Peninsula, where somehow, somewhere in Asia, there's now a pervasive sense that the chance of a dispute sparking some kind of altercation, sparking some kind of conflict, there's a pervasive sense that that risk is going up and not down, that the danger that something will not be managed is going up. And the multiplication of potential areas where you could have a flashpoint is something that I think has seized everybody as the potential danger to what has been this great run for the Asia-Pacific. Another area of risk, which I think actually plays into this because it plays into how countries behave with one another, is what you might call sort of maybe even a stagnation risk. So stagnation is something that India has been dealing with as its economy slowed, and that China has been dealing with. And when countries look around and see that they're having a hard time meeting the needs of their own people, there's often a tendency to say, well, we've got lots of stuff. It's somebody else's fault. It's because of what's going on in the neighborhood. We're going to be more bellicose. We're going to stand up to our neighbors and sort of tap into nationalism. And so I think the stagnation risk, both economic and potentially political, again, it's a region that's seen a lot of democratization, progress on human rights, progress. But if you have political and economic stagnation within these countries, the risk that they will sort of turn to nationalism and turn therefore to more destabilizing approaches to the neighborhood, that increases. And then the final area, and it really gets at ASEAN, is I think there's a real risk of sort of what you might, I mean, maybe cooperation paralysis in the region. So ASEAN has managed to make great strides by being a consensus-driven organization and being patient. A lot more patient than we'd ever be. So they've taken a long time to go what seems like a little distance, but it's been something that's actually redefined how Asia functions. It has brought us to an era where for a long time now there's been very limited risk of interstate conflict, and there's been a great trend of reductions of intrastate conflict and political violence. But we're getting to the point where I think there's a sense that cooperating on the really hard issues is too risky. And we risk having the announcement next year of an ASEAN community being something that rings a little hollow. If things like codes of conduct and ASEAN community just become ways to have nice talk shops, but don't develop into mechanisms that can help Asia manage the strategic competitions we see going on, I think that will pose great risk for the region. And so for us, the question is, how does the United States both deter and dissuade countries from taking actions that could really spark conflict, and how do we invest in and partner with the region to help make those developing institutions all they could be? And there is a real opportunity there, because I think that the tendency of the region is to find a way forward. But it might not be enough to do it just in the ASEAN way. I think there's going to be a little bit of getting down to brass tacks, the way that that we try to, the way that Americans are kind of good at saying, let's try to get this hard issue out and find a way forward on it.
David, you've written many governmental memos for secretaries and senior officials about the risks that they face and the opportunities. One of the big questions that I see repeated often, and I think it should be a question more than an assumption, is that economic integration cannot keep growing as long as strategic competition and confrontation is also growing. And I'm not sure that's true. It may be that we live with this very, very fluctuating situation where some days it's just more competitive and confrontational, then we go back, or is it inherently unstable?
Well, I think this now is the big challenge in Asia, that for all of the geopolitical contestation, the power of nationalism, different ideologies, lack of a common institutional framework of any kind, you've had this powerful driver of economic interdependence and particularly supply chain interdependence really serving as the other reality in Asia. What I think the big risk is now is when I look at Chinese behavior, it doesn't make clear strategic sense to me, because for every effort to create maritime facts on the ground in the South China Sea, you encourage this bandwagoning effect of more regional cooperation, much more of reliance on turning to the United States. So the United States has been the big beneficiary of that. And in fact, I've argued that the whole rebalancing and pivot was essentially demand-driven. It was our friends and allies who were looking for this restatement. So the question that troubles me, and I don't think we have a really good sense of this, is what's going on in Xi Jinping's head? I mean, you've had this centralization of the institutional structure in China, including on the national security side. So I don't think that people view these activities as the PLA or the PLA Navy off on their own. And if the Chinese really believe scholar Hugh White's interpretation of this, that at the end of the day, the United States really isn't going to play that balancing role, that powerful ally for our friends, then that really is a pathway to a much more difficult relationship. Let me just conclude by saying I totally agree with Nick's framework that he laid out. From the Chinese perspective, though, the cooperation side of this hasn't been made manifest. I don't think if you talk to the Chinese, you would get this vision of both competition and partnership. And so I think part of the solution here, ironically, is I think in East Asia, in the Pacific, the relationship is inherently competitive. So what you have to find with China is where are the elements of collaboration that can begin to counter what they see as an essentially competitive relationship. So I'm in favor both of toughness with allies and sending very clear signals, but also really seeking out where are the areas of collaboration and that we can really make this manifest for Chinese goals and Chinese interests.
In general, as all these other issues are percolating around the world and in the region, you worry about what the young leader in North Korea might do, despite the fact that the Republic of Korea has been such a successful economy and democracy. You've worked it and lived it, yet it seems like deterrence could fail. How do you see the risk on the peninsula?
Well, first off, thanks for having me here today. I just recently retired from the Army on 1 December. This last assignment was probably my most challenging assignment.
He's had some very challenging assignments.
Here's why I say this. I watched Kim Jong-un take charge in North Korea. I was a bit optimistic. We had the leap year deal happen on 29 February, where we were going to exchange nutritional assistance if they would quit their missile testing and nuclear development. And then he announces a Taepodong launch. On 13 April, he launched a Taepodong. It failed in the first 90 seconds. And we said, oh, well, we knew it was going to fail and all that. And then I watched on 12 April, put a satellite in orbit. That delivery means is the same delivery means that's on a KN-08, which is a road mobile ICBM with 12,300 kilometers. You have a very dangerous man over there right now. And I would characterize him as more dangerous than Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. Because I do not believe the North Koreans will give up nuclear capabilities. They're not. They see that as regime survival. I also watched them replace over 90% of their military leaders. I also watched them continue development with a missile portfolio, investing in asymmetrical capabilities. They're the number 2 chemical stockpile holder in the world today. So the greatest risk today is with a miscalculation, because I was assigned to Korea right after sinking of the Cronin, where 46 ROK sailors were killed, the shelling of Yongpyeong-do Island, where 4 people were killed, and I'm here to tell you the South Koreans will not accept that type of behavior any longer. So the risk of a miscalculation is something I dealt with every day. And so we got lulled into a bit of status quo there on how we deal with them. But sooner or later, we're going to have to deal with this problem because it's not going away. And so the opportunities of the future, I think, is more Chinese involvement to help settle that regime down up there, because the situation is volatile and it's dangerous. That tells me as a military man that we better stay ready and we better keep the joint forces over capable of helping defend that country. That is the one place where the U.S. commander is held accountable for the defense of that country. And we should not forget that. The only thing we have is armistice. That's a ceasefire. That's a separation of forces. So I think it's something we're really going to have to get our arms around. I think we should stay in a combined arrangement with the South Koreans. The South Koreans are our greatest friends. And it was wonderful working with them. And where I really saw what's important about what the United States does is last July, the 60th anniversary when we signed the armistice and the Korean War veterans came back. We don't need another war on the peninsula. My job, number one, was to prevent war and preserve U.S. options. And you do that with strong readiness, because that's the deterrence that we bring and assurance to the allies, not only to the South Koreans, but also for the region, the Japanese. And so I think the opportunities of the future is, one, what do we do with the policy of how we deal with an uncooperative regime that is very dangerous right now, and somebody that's got to be reckoned with here, and it's not going to go away.
General, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. Let's go and take a few questions, collect a few. We'll try to get 2 or 3. I see a hand back here in the middle. The bright lights are preventing me from actually seeing a face, but I see a hand.
Hi, Leo. It's General Thurman. Can you talk about potential operational control transfer to ROK forces, and whether that could cause DPRK to misperceive U.S. intentions on the Korean Peninsula? Thank you.
We're going to collect just a few questions, just so we can get some audience participation here, at least indirectly. And it's very difficult. Yes, yes, sir, over here. I see.
You mentioned the challenge, Pete Shutley, retired State Department. You mentioned the challenge of cooperating and competing with China. My question is, what are the prospects of us cooperating together in space, maybe Mars? We did Soyuz with the Soviets in '75. Why can't we do something with the Chinese long way down the road?
Thank you, sir. Is there a question over on this side? Yes, sir. There's a microphone coming, John.
John Hanley, just an interested American citizen, but General Cartwright said that we would like to get away from mutually assured destruction. But in the event of actual conflict with China, why would China want to get away from mutually assured destruction as a strategy?
Excellent. Yes, sir.
This is for General Cronin. This morning we had a guest here from China, a professor, visiting professor who's now at Brookings, I believe, who made the statement that if the United States just dealt with the North Korean problem, took care of it immediately, quickly, the Chinese would be upset about it for a while, they'd talk about it, but they wouldn't do a thing and they'd be happy. How do you respond to that?
Well, very good. And yes, we'll take one last question over here.
Hi.
Oh,
Whoa, sorry about that.
non-lethal warfare, yes.
My name is Kiara Earl. I'm a William & Mary National Security Institute student and intern at the DOS. My question is, there was mention of a need for effectiveness of ASEAN, and I wondered, would that come from more U.S. involvement, or rather we should encourage more regional governance?
Excellent. So we've got a couple of questions on Korea, a couple on China cooperation, one on the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the ASEAN Southeast Asian grouping. And then for those of you who didn't feel like you were asked a question, this is the chance to come in on what big opportunity, and either coming back, Nick, in terms of the opportunity you outlined. I know, David, you want to talk a bit about the opportunity. Journal, why don't we start with you on these two Korea questions on OPCON? And
Okay, on the first one on OPCON, which is a very good question. I believe we need to stay in a combined arrangement in Korea. That's where you have ROK US. That gives us the best opportunity to, one, control a conflict. What you don't want to do is find yourself racing to a conflict. We will lose in a hurry, and we learned many lessons back in 1950. It needs to be conditions-based. Conditions-based.
you're talking about the transfer back of wartime operational control.
Wartime. It needs to be conditions-based. I know there's ongoing discussions about that, and that is really important of staying engaged in there with that. But I, for one, believe you need a U.S. commander that's there on the ground right now till the Republic of Korea has sufficient command and control capabilities and what they need to command and control joint and combined forces. That's what I'd leave you with on that. the question on China. I think China has a lot of investment in Korea. If you look today in North Korea, along the North Korean Chinese border up there, they've strengthened their border because they don't want a sudden refugee flow. I think China shares a great responsibility in helping control a conflict there, because I don't think they want a conflict either. And I think also they're satisfied with having us, with the U.S. in there, because we're a stabilizing influence. That's what we really do in there. So the real question is what do we do for the future? And then how is reunification going to be handled? Because it's in the Republic of Korea's constitution to reunify the peninsula someday. And so that's something that I would tell you that is often debated.
Yes, sir. David.
So I think there may be long-range opportunities for the U.S. and China in space, but I think we have to do a lot of confidence building before we get there. I mean, my view is that there's a big opportunity for the United States coming out of the progress that we've made in trade negotiations, particularly the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think for that concluding that agreement is really critical for the credibility of the United States, both with our friends in the region that we're going to be there, but also to China to say that we are a long-term resilient Asian Pacific power. We also have a big potential here with energy, and in particular with natural gas, and the fact that China definitely wants into the U.S. unconventionals revolution, both to get the technology and as part of their own diversification. So these are win-win outcomes, and I think on energy in particular, there is the big potential for a North America, Northeast Asia energy entente, because Asia needs cheaper natural gas. You not only have the US, but Canada and Mexico as providers, and anything I think that brings Korea and Japan to the table with essentially the same interests is something that's favorable for the United States. So I actually believe that there is a very powerful agenda, mostly on the economic and commercial side, that can really serve to complement the role of military forces and deterrence and make that more real, give the Chinese more of an institutional interest in America's stability at home and presence in the region, to balance off what at the end of the day will always be a competitive relationship in terms of influence in the region.
Vikram Singh.
I would just say, just to touch on what David was talking about, it's important to remember things get very sort of fraught and heated when you talk about US-China already. It's as if somehow things are terrible, but actually things are remarkably good when you consider what the dynamics could be between a rising power and an established power in this kind of situation. The establishment of mechanisms like the strategic and economic dialogue mean that China and the United States are constantly engaged on a host of issues. And so the areas for cooperation, space is an interesting one to mention. I agree with David, I think it would be some time off, but it's not inconceivable. But certainly energy, trade, foreign investment going both ways, climate and climate impacts, not only as our individual nations, but in the region. China's need to deal with managing the environmental impact of its rapid development is something that U.S. technology and U.S. know-how can significantly help with. There is a win-win enmeshing of China and the United States with the other nations in the region working on common challenges. One of the problems is that China is doubtful about being bound into the system that Stephanie was talking about. not convinced that it is truly in China's interest to be bound in that system, and wanting to hedge its bets and think about whether it should be changing some of the rules of the game as we move forward. And so it is both a reassurance to allies, but also a reassurance to China that there is a positive reason for China to participate in this system. And David made a very interesting point earlier. Really, it's not, if we take on face value what's being done in terms of provoking other countries in the region, it doesn't seem to be in China's strategic interest. Because actually, China would have a high likelihood of getting a lot of what it's looking for in terms of sovereignty and access to resources and things like that if it took a very benign approach in its region. Every country in the region has China as their largest trading partner. Nobody wants to screw that up. So China could be acting with a greater degree of confidence when it comes to what role it's going to have vis-a-vis its neighbors and what role the United States is going to have. So I think there's a lot of area for cooperation. Really quickly on ASEAN, there's two factors here. One, of course, is us being reassuring about our presence. But just as China protests too much about the United States' intentions, which are certainly not containment, but more enmeshing and bringing China into a constructive regional order, many of our other friends in Southeast Asia will protest a lot about, oh, you're not really going to be here. You're not really going to be with us. So part of it is, engaging and reassuring them, but part of it is the nations in Southeast Asia finding ways in their very complicated political environment without strong institutions and with countries at very different stages of development, finding a way to say there's a few things where we need to cooperate. And at the end of the day, the countries in Asia are going to have to come together and say we want a stable order, we want to diffuse some of these tensions. And that's both China and the individual ASEAN states have to decide that they're willing to put the political effort into that. We can't make that happen as the United States. What we can do is be there to back up good trends and to stand ready to deal with things should anything become an actual crisis. We should maintain our capabilities, just as General Thurman was saying, to be able to act should we ever need to.
Time is running, but Stephanie and then Nick.
So just quickly, because there have been questions about China's strategy and what Xi Jinping thinking. I mean, the amazing thing about Xi Jinping is that everything is laid out completely transparently. Even the CNOOC operation that was essentially foreshadowed in CNOOC documents a decade ago. Everything is out there. What we Westerners can't understand is this paradox that China has on the one hand between needing a stable and peaceful external environment to focus on its own economic development and needing at the same time to make progress on getting back some of the territories that it claims in line with its strategy to become a maritime power, which is based on eliminating the vulnerability in their arc of security, which has been threats always coming from the sea. And so in order to do that, Chinese academics are now talking about things such as extended coercion instead of extended deterrence, which means, well, what happens when you want to coerce a small country and it so happens that there's a large country behind it? How do we do that better? And they've recognized ADIS. They wanted to do an ADIS, but they went a bit too far. They didn't check the boxes, and that was because it was kept close hold. It was a PLA Air Force plan. But they're going to have a new National Security Commission. But everything is now centralized, and the idea is they need to make progress on these things, and to be honest, they're not feeling the costs. The costs are not outweighing the benefits for China right now, and it partly goes back to what I said earlier. Just quickly on North Korea, China's frustration with North Korea is the highest it's ever been. I visited North Korea 6 times. I've spoken on both sides. I've done a lot of research on this. They are essentially out of their minds with frustration at Kim Jong-un. Here's the problem. They actually believe that the US is more threatening to their security environment than North Korea. And so that outweighs, they essentially believe that the US is using North Korea as a pretext to strengthen our Asia rebalance, to engage in military exercises, embolden our allies and the like. So when when China looks at the North Korea issue, it's like an iceberg. The very tip of it is North Korea. The entire base is the United States. That's why when we want to get things out of China and North Korea, we do shows of force. We send high-ticket items over South Korea because this essentially immediately impacts negatively their security environment. All that is to say that we aren't going to get that much out of China and North Korea unless we change our strategy, change our assumptions behind strategic patience, and make a decision to move that issue up in the bilateral relationship, which is almost impossible to see doing, particularly given that the Chinese are very into issue linkage these days. So if you want to talk about North Korea, the first thing is, can't you let up on joint exercises with Japan? Why don't you let up on all these announcements with Vietnam? So these things are all trade-offs in Chinese minds, and they see where these things fit for us. And we have a whole panoply of issues to manage with China, and the question is, where does North Korea come in that? And they play that very much to their advantage.
Dick Burns, when you were at the State Department, you were the voice of reassurance. Should we be reassured or worried about this region?
Reassured by my colleagues in the panel, certainly. I think, the question was, can we have a partnership with China? I don't think that President Obama has received enough credit, and he deserves credit, for trying to form some kind of relationship, strategic relationship with Xi Jinping that began at Sunnylands, continued in The Hague in March, and will continue this year. Look for both governments to try to have an early agreement on climate change cooperation. That could be one of the elements that forms a global compact in 2015. Look for co-management, if you will, for global macroeconomic stability. On the huge basket of transnational issues that we talked about at the beginning, we're the two most important countries. On space, I just say, maybe there's an opportunity. There's a need for some kind of symbolic issue where China and the United States, for the global good, can cooperate together. I just don't want to see the United States be a passenger, the way we were with the Russians over the last 20 years, become a passenger, lose our own national capacity in engineering and science, and see NASA weakened through underfunding. So maybe. And just finally, Patrick, I'd say there's a very strong positive opportunity for the United States to rebuild the India relationship. Prime Minister Modi will be here in Washington to see President Obama in September. I hope we'll see a caravan of American cabinet secretaries and sub-cabinet officials, because here's the opportunity. Modi needs to kickstart the Indian economy. We can be very helpful through our private sector and through government-to-government cooperation, first. Second, India is our most important air and sea partner in the Indian Ocean. More exercises last year with India than with Germany or Japan or Britain. A growing strategic relationship. And third, with the American pseudo-withdrawal, if you will, from Afghanistan, although I hope we retain a strong, capable counter-terror force there, the Indians are going to be very important on the outcome in Afghanistan. What Modi does with the Prime Minister of Pakistan will be important for global and regional stability. And the first place Modi's going is the country that wants the deepest relationship with him, Tokyo. Right. And so it's in our interest to see a strong Japan-India relationship. It's in our interest to build a trilateral relationship, Tokyo, Washington, and Delhi. This needn't threaten the Chinese. They will be threatened by it. Right. It's all just to say that the democratic powers need to strengthen, and that's the vehicle. So the key is to get back to where President Clinton and President Bush, and I think where President Obama was in his 2010 state visit. Since then, the relationship stalled. I think the president has a great opportunity. He has a personal interest in India, and that, I think, is maybe one of the cornerstones of Obama foreign policy in the year ahead.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
I just want to point out as well that India is a rare source of excellent demographics amongst our friends and allies in the Asia-Pacific region. But I think since we're talking about strengthening relations with India, I think it's also important to point out the necessity of working with both Republic of Korea, South Korea, and Japan to repair that relationship. When we're looking at threats coming from the Korean Peninsula, we're looking at the implications of a rising China. It's really unacceptable that we're at the place that we are right now. The U.S. has taken steps. Some of them have been more successful than others. There's a lot that can be done in the military plane, and I think that that's something that needs to be at least flagged in this panel, if not discussed.
Vikram, one last question on Indonesia. Are we going to be able to capitalize and follow through on the comprehensive partnership with Indonesia after the July 9 election?
I certainly hope so. I expect so. I think the relationship with Indonesia has grown stronger and deeper over several years, and it will be able to withstand whatever comes. It's going to be a strong partnership going forward. Just to build on real quick on the India point that Ambassador Burns made, which I think is extraordinarily important. Really, you've got new regimes in China, relatively new still in China, relatively new in Japan, and brand new in India. this is a unique moment, and there's two sides of it. One is how we cooperate with our strategic partners and allies, and the U.S.-Japan-India trilateral relationship has been going really from strength to strength. It hasn't been one of the top issues that anybody hears about, but there is a tremendous desire among all three for more cooperation, and that's been something that's really been growing in the last few years, and so there's a huge opportunity there. But with all of these leaders of the dominant powers of Asia, the time is going to come soon for them to be able to pick up the phone, to talk to each other, to find ways on the margins of big international forums to actually start working out how are we going to have a constructive, mutually beneficial partnership in the Indo-Asia-Pacific, as Patrick has called it, going forward. So I think there's a huge moment of potential for the region, even as we see all these disputes percolating and all these reasons for worry.
David, I wonder if I can come back and put Russia into the discussion, because it's both an Asia-Pacific as well as a European power. And its actions, obviously, in Crimea in particular, have given the world pause about its intentions. It does seem to have a policy of seeking alignment, a marriage of convenience with China, to kind of block the United States. How do you view the Russian decision-making calculus going forward and its implications for Asia in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the Russians have their own pivot to Asia, and they certainly seek an alliance with China. I mean, the striking thing to me about the meeting between President Putin and Xi Jinping, what was it, a week and a half ago, was Xi Jinping kept Putin waiting 36 hours on the Gazprom agreement. And this was really about who's driving this relationship. And at the end of the day, Beijing is driving it. But I do believe that what we're seeing is the emergence of the rebirth of the strategic triangle between the US, China, and Russia. I wrote about this in Foreign Affairs a couple of weeks ago, with the difference being that the intense antagonism between the China and the Soviet Union enabled the US to play a driving role for the last 20 years of the Cold War. I do think China is now the country best positioned to play off the powers here. I do believe that China is very much learning from the Ukraine crisis. I think this partial shift away from the Senkakus to Vietnam is their judgment of, okay, the US really differentiates between treaty allies and friends, and that escalation in the Senkaku is too risky. You can escalate and create maritime facts on the ground against Vietnam. The Americans aren't going to do anything. But Russia isn't going to get the kind of anti-American alliance from China for all of the very reasons that Nick presented. But I do think that this alliance is going to embolden, this relationship, is going to embolden China, particularly in the region, and raise the bar for us. It raises the bar for what we have to do to succeed in the Asia-Pacific region.
General, I wonder if we can come back to North Korea. Stephanie mentioned how frustrated the Chinese are with North Korea. Is North Korea now on its own? And if so, what are the implications for Kim Jong-un? I mean, he's killed his uncle. He has replaced so many of the generals. He has access to nuclear weapons, presumably, as well as missiles and special operations forces and agents, and can create disturbances on the northern limit line. I mean, what is holding him back? I mean, how is he? Do we have any idea about how he could make decisions that could lead to literally an instantaneous escalation?
I would tell you, I think the Kim regime inside the inner circle is probably the hardest intelligence target we have. Because we really don't know what's going on inside the motivation and why he's doing what he's doing. I believe he believes he has to protect the regime. One of the biggest opportunities we have over there in the near future is to continue to strengthen the Japan-South Korean relationships with the U.S. over there when it comes to dealing with these problems. But that's what makes this a very dangerous recipe right now with how Kim Jong-un operates. He's very assertive. He's a bit of a hothead, and he'll make snap decisions. So, you know, who's helping rein him in? That's why I think China plays a huge role in that, to help prevent war and something from starting very quickly. And that's what will happen if we're not careful. So that's what makes this such a volatile situation that we're dealing with today, with an unpredictable young man, 30 years old, that's probably wanting to prove himself a bit. And so strong U.S. commitment over there is really what's required. So there's no doubt in anybody's mind that we're going to be there when it goes wrong, if it does go wrong. And I was questioned about that quite a bit from our allies. And so I think we must seize on the opportunity in this rebalance to, you know, keep a credible defense in there, so one, we can protect the people. Seoul is close to the DMZ now. There's over 23.5 million people that is butted up against the DMZ. So any missile or artillery round that is fired to the south is going to hit something. And somebody's going to get hurt and they're going to die. So that's how dangerous this situation is.
Mm-hmm. Now, Vikram, do you want to come in?
And, you know, General Thurman touched on the need to reassure the ally in South Korea, and the reassurance question comes up a lot. Are we doing enough, saying enough to reassure all our partners and allies in the region? You can't overstate the impact, not of Ukraine and Syria and all the other woes that we face around the world, but of the woes we face at home in terms of reassurance. What is very fundamentally undermining confidence in the United States are things like the fact that the U.S. will seriously go up to multiple times potentially defaulting on its debt, the fact that the U.S. will have a government shutdown, the fact that the U.S. will have something like sequester, the fact that the U.S. will politicize so many issues of national security that allies worry that, hey, when the balloon goes up and we need the United States, what if they politicize us? And this is so the need to figure out a way to have some consensus and to make sure that in the Asia Pacific, you know, one of the key ingredients to a stable Asia Pacific is going to be U.S. attention and U.S. involvement. They really can't afford to take our eye off the ball, and we can't afford to be, you know, say that because we're just tied into too many things happening in other parts of the world, we're not going to be as active in implementing the policy that we've articulated as we've said we're going to be. So there's a lot there, but a lot of it comes to what's happening with dysfunction in Washington in terms of when allies and partners are wondering about, will the U.S. be there or not?
More general question about leadership, and Nick, I was going to turn to you and just talk about how U.S. leadership appears around the world as you travel around the world, and you've been looking at this for a long time. Where are we relative to where we've been and where we seem to be headed?
I think we're in a very difficult place, and there's no reason to sugarcoat it. I mean, I would say I think that President Obama has done many strong things in foreign policy, and the Asia pivot and the focus on Asia, and certainly the Iran policy. He took the policy that David and I worked on together in the Bush administration, and he strengthened it. And we've got Iran coerced into these negotiations. But having said that, I think when you travel around the world, people talk about the Syria decision. In the cruel, cynical, bitter world of the Middle East politics, of authoritarian leaders, if you draw a line in the sand and your adversary crosses it and you don't do what you said you're going to do, people then perceive things about you that you don't want them to. And that's a problem for this administration. Ukraine has added to it, and I would say I think the president's instincts, the programmatic elements of the policy have been right, but there hasn't been the kind of strong symbolic leadership that an American president would normally exercise in the NATO alliance. Now, having said all that, so there's a big perception problem, the Economist cover of 3 weeks ago. But having said all that, the president has 30 months left. He's obviously got 4 or 5 things he wants to do. He can exercise strong leadership. I don't think the country should give up on him, and it's in all of our interest to see him succeed. And I do sense in the administration, talking to people here in Washington, they understand that the United States needs to exert strong leadership in NATO, with the East Asian allies, and in the Middle East. So I certainly want to support the president in that direction.
David, you're going to get the last word.
I think that I completely agree with Nick. I was in Japan last week, and I think if you push the Japanese, I mean, the president's saying all the right things, but when they look, they just don't know if it's going to happen. So I think that the president is hopefully going to have two huge opportunities here. After the election, you have the ability to close the TPP negotiations. This is going to take an intensive effort to work with the Congress, the likes of which we haven't seen yet. If we're getting near an agreement with Iran, and I'm still optimistic that we're heading there, the president faces the same issue. He has to work intensely with the Congress because the congressional piece of this is critical. So I think, I mean, President Obama has the ability to add two very, very big pieces to his foreign policy legacy. But I think he laid this out frankly in the State of the Union speech earlier this year, where he's so frustrated with the Congress and he wants to go it alone, and it's not going to work. So I do think it's going to take the kind of leadership in recreating a relationship, a working relationship between the president and the legislative branch to get us over the bar where we have to go.
And I think that will happen next year after the election, and I'm hopeful. We're going to end on that hopeful note. I took no risk in inviting the five of you here to speak today, but please join me in thanking this panel.